In his masterpiece, Summa Theologica, the great medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, born 1225, died 1274, grapples with a question. Is it ever permissible to defend oneself against an unjust attack, he asks, knowing that doing so will cause serious harm or even death to the attacker? This was a genuinely vexing question for Aquinas. One of his illustrious predecessors, the 4th century North African philosopher and theologian Augustine of Hippo, also known as Saint Augustine, had earlier given an emphatically negative answer to Aquinas' question. To Saint Augustine, killing in self-defense, even against an unjust attack, was never permissible. Augustine argued that private self-defense can only proceed from some inordinate degree of self-love. To Aquinas, however, this answer appeared too extreme. Surely there are contexts, he reasoned, in which it is permissible to defend myself against an unjust assault, even by killing the attacker. But at the same time, as a Christian thinker, Aquinas was convinced that directly aiming at the death of another human being, even a culpable aggressor, was morally wrong. How to square this circle? Aquinas' famous answer in his Summa Theologica goes like this. Killing one's assailant is justified, provided one does not intend to kill him, but only intends to save one's life. As Aquinas writes, quote, "Nothing hinders one act from having two effects, only one of which is intended, while the other is beside the intention. Accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects. One, the saving of one's life, the other, the slaying of the aggressor. Therefore, since one's intention is to save one's own life, this act is not unlawful, seeing that it is natural to everything to keep itself in being as far as possible." But at the same time, Aquinas observes, the permissibility of self-defense, even done with the correct intention, is subject to further conditions. He writes, "And yet, though proceeding from a good intention, an act may be rendered unlawful if it be out of proportion to the end. Wherefore, if a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful, whereas if he repel force with moderation, his defense will be lawful." End quote. What Aquinas lays out in this passage is what has come to be known as the Doctrine of Double-Effect. This doctrine has been extremely influential, both on moral thought in the Catholic tradition, but also on secular moral philosophy. In contemporary discussions, the scope of the doctrine is usually broadened so that it applies not just to the context of self-defense against an unjust attack, but more widely to all situations where an agent can bring about an important good, but only by causing another person to suffer harm. So, in most contemporary discussions of the doctrine of double effect, the principle is stated roughly as follows. It is sometimes permissible for an agent to bring about a harm in the pursuit of an important good when, firstly, the harm is necessary to achieve the good. That is, the good cannot be achieved without causing the harm. Secondly, the harm is proportionate to the good. That is, the amount of harm your action will cause to achieve the good is not too large in relation to the amount of good that you will achieve. And thirdly, the harm is merely foreseen, but not intended. By contrast, the doctrine states, it is not permissible, or at least much less easily justifiable, to cause harm if that harm is itself intended and not merely foreseen. It is this third clause of the Doctrine of Double-Effect that Warren Quinn focuses on in his article, Actions, Intentions, and Consequences, which we will discuss in today's lecture. Let us immediately note some of the implications of the Doctrine of Double-Effect, especially its third clause. If the Doctrine of Double-Effect is a sound moral principle, then an agent's intentions in acting will often matter to the permissibility of her action. two actions may have the same consequential profile, as Quinn calls it. That is, the goodness of their consequences may be the same. Yet one action may be permissible and the other impermissible, depending on the intentions with which the agent performed the actions. So, in determining whether an action that produced benefits to some but harms to others was permissible, we will need to know, was the harm merely a foreseen but unintended side effect of the agent's action? Or did the agent intend to bring about the harm? According to the doctrine of double effect, the rightness of an action often is therefore not an exclusive function of the goodness of its consequences. In addition, it also matters what the agent's mental state was in acting, specifically whether the agent intended or merely foresaw the harmful effects of her action. The doctrine of double effect is therefore a non-consequentialist doctrine. Warren Quinn begins his article with three pairs of cases that are meant to motivate the doctrine of double effect. In each case, intuitively, the case in which a harm is produced intentionally and not just as a foreseen side effect of pursuing a good, is morally harder to justify. Why don't you get out your copy of Quinn's paper and take a minute to locate the three cases I'm referring to and remind yourself of the details. I'll wait for you. All right. Let's quickly go over the three pairs of cases together. Quinn's first pair of cases juxtaposes two military raids. Suppose that, in the course of fighting a just war, a general orders the bombing of a munitions factory, foreseeing but not intending that 50 innocent civilians will die as collateral damage. He rightly expects that this will hasten the end of the war by 1 month. Let's call this case tactical bombing. Contrast it with the following variation. In the course of fighting a just war, a general orders the bombing of a residential area in order to sow terror among the civilian population and thereby undermine enemy morale. He foresees and intends that 50 civilians will die in the raid, and he rightly expects that this will hasten the end of the war by 1 month. Let's call this case terror bombing. What do we see when we compare these two scenarios? Well, the goodness of the expected result is comparable in both cases. 50 innocent civilians will die, but the end of the war will be hastened by 1 month. For the consequentialist, this is all that matters. So if we think that it is permissible for the general to order the tactical bombing in the first scenario, then it must also be permissible to terror bomb, as in the second scenario. But are these two courses of action really morally on a par? Many people think that while the former military raid may be permissible, some collateral damage is unfortunately unavoidable even in fighting a just war. The latter, terror bombing raid, is categorically impermissible. The British moral philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe gives powerful expression to this sentiment in her pamphlet Mr. Truman's Degree, which was the supplementary reading for today. Anscombe wrote this pamphlet in protest at President Harry Truman being awarded an honorary degree by Oxford University in 1956. For Anscombe, Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which followed on the heels of the month-long firebombing of most major Japanese population centers that is estimated to have killed 330,000 civilians, this was the ultimate act of terror bombing. Such actions, even in the service of bringing World War II to a swifter conclusion by demoralizing the Japanese population, were categorically unjustifiable, she thought. In deliberately aiming to kill the innocent as a means to his ends, Truman, in Anscombe's eyes, was a mass murderer. The second of Quinn's cases involves medicine, Here's how he describes it. In both cases, Quinn says, there's a shortage of resources for the investigation and proper treatment of a new life-threatening disease. In the first scenario, doctors decide to cope by selectively treating only those who can be cured most easily, leaving the more stubborn cases untreated. Call this the direction of resources case. In the contrasting and intuitively more problematic example, doctors decide on a crash experimental program in which they deliberately leave the stubborn cases untreated in order to learn more about the nature of the disease. By this strategy, they reasonably expect to do as much long-term medical good as they would in direction of resources. Call this the guinea pig case. Again, though the cases are alike in their consequential profile, many people have the considered moral judgment that there is a moral difference between these cases. What is done in the first case is potentially morally acceptable. When resources are scarce, doctors sometimes permissibly resort to rules of triage, prioritizing the cases where they can make the largest positive difference, while reluctantly leaving the more stubborn cases untreated. By contrast, deliberately leaving patients untreated with the aim of gathering useful medical knowledge seems much harder to justify. You would never get such a study past an ethical review board. Quinn's third pair of cases, which is also a staple of the literature on the doctrine of double effect, is also drawn from the domain of medicine. In what he calls the craniotomy case, a woman will die unless the head of the fetus she is trying to deliver is crushed. But the fetus may be safely removed if the mother is allowed to die. In the contrasting hysterectomy case, a pregnant mother's uterus is cancerous and must be removed if she is to be saved. This will, given the limits of available medical technology, kill the fetus. But if no operation is performed, the mother will eventually die after giving birth to a healthy infant, die of cancer. As Quinn notes, many people see less of a moral difference between these two cases than between the first two pairs. At the end of his paper, he'll suggest an explanation for why that should be so, and we'll return to that at the end of this lecture. All right, so these are the types of cases which are standardly appealed to in motivating the doctrine of double effect. We have a pair of cases which are alike in their consequential profile, and yet we detect an intuitive difference between the cases. The doctrine of double effect promises to explain this difference. The reason why the action seems harder to justify in one case than the other is that in one case, the agent intends the harm to those who are negatively affected by his action, whereas in the other case, the harm is merely foreseen, but not intended. Now, before we go on to discuss the doctrine of double effect in more detail, we must pause for an important clarification. The fact is, the word intention or intentional action is used with at least two subtly different meanings in English, what I will call the wide and the narrow sense of intention. An action that is intentional in the wide sense is contrasted with an action that is unintentional or accidental. The relevant questions in determining whether an action was intentional in this wide sense include: did the agent act this way on purpose? And what was the agent aware of in acting? Notice that an action can be intentional in this wide sense under one description, but unintentional under another description. Consider the story of Oedipus from Greek mythology. Oedipus intentionally marries Jocasta, the queen of Thebes. But Oedipus most certainly does not intentionally marry his mother, although, unbeknownst to Oedipus, Jocasta is Oedipus's mother. So by marrying Jocasta, Oedipus is marrying his mother. Oedipus's action is intentional in the wide sense under the description of marrying Jocasta. He didn't accidentally end up married to the Queen of Thebes. But his action is not intentional, even in the wide sense, under the description of marrying his mother. Oedipus genuinely had no idea that this is what he was doing. Okay, so that's what I call an action's being intentional in the wide sense. By contrast, in the narrow sense of intention, an agent's intentions in acting are what the agent was aiming at in acting. They are his goals in acting. Now, it's very important to notice that being intentional in the wide sense does not imply being intended in the narrow sense. For example, when a surgeon makes an incision into your body that causes you pain, her action is hopefully intentional in the wide sense. She really meant to make the cut in the place she did, even knowing that this would cause you pain. It wasn't just a slip of the scalpel, for example. But likewise, we would hope that the surgeon was not intending, in a narrow sense, to cause you pain. That was not her aim or goal in acting. Her intention, in the narrow sense, was to heal you, not to hurt you. All right, so having distinguished a wide and a narrow sense in which an agent can intentionally cause harm to another, let me put another question to you. Which is the sense of intention that is relevant to the doctrine of double effect? In other words, what does the doctrine of double effect object to? Intentionally causing harm to another in the wide sense, or intentionally causing harm to another in the narrow sense? Take a moment to consider your answer. I'll wait for you. All right. The answer is that it is intentionally causing harm in the narrow sense that the doctrine of double effect specifically objects to. The surgeon who makes an incision into your arm is acting intentionally in the wide sense. Her behavior is not unintentional or accidental. But while the surgeon foresees that her action will cause you pain, this is not her intention in the narrow sense. Her aim is to heal you. The doctrine of double effect has no objection to this behavior. What the doctrine of double effect does specifically object to is only intending harm to others in the narrow sense, that is, purposefully aiming to do them harm, as in the case of the terror bomber, or the guinea pig case. But wait a second. Now it seems we face a worry, which Warren Quinn raises in section 1 of his article. If the kind of intention that matters to the doctrine of double effect is intention in the narrow sense, then doesn't the doctrine perhaps become much too easy to satisfy? We might wonder, in the cases that we used to illustrate the intuitive appeal of the doctrine of double effect, the terror bomber case and the guinea pig case, is it really necessarily the case that the harm is intended in the narrow sense? Take the example of terror bombing. Must a terror bomber necessarily intend to kill his victims in the narrow sense? Perhaps, strictly speaking, all the terror bomber intends is for his victims to appear dead. Whether they are actually killed or not does not matter to his plan of demoralizing the enemy population. Now, of course, in reality, the only way in which the terror bomber can reliably make these people appear dead is by actually killing them. But that, it might be said, is incidental to his plan and not what he really intends or aims at. As Quinn writes, if by some miracle these people came back to life after the war was over, the terror bomber would not object. And something similar might be said about the doctors in the guinea pig case as well. While they need the disease to continue its course in order to gain medical knowledge, they do not need the victims actually to be harmed by it. If by some miracle the victims developed special ways of withstanding the disease so that they remained comfortable and well-functioning despite the disease's progress, the doctors would be glad. Intuitively, Quinn thinks these actions remain wrong, even if the harm is not intended in the most narrow sense. So here's how Quinn proposes to finesse this problem. His proposal comes at the start of section 2 of his paper. Quinn proposes to cash out the contrast between intended and merely foreseen harms in the doctrine of double effect as that between what he calls direct and indirect harmful agency. As he writes on page 343, I quote, "The doctrine of double effect distinguishes between agency in which harm comes to some victims from the agent deliberately involving them in something in order to further his purposes, precisely by the way of their being so involved." This is what he calls direct agency. And harmful agency in which either nothing is in that way intended for the victims, or what is so intended does not contribute to their harm. That is what Quinn calls indirect agency. So, seen this way, the relevant difference between terror bomber and strategic bomber is this. Even if the terror bomber need not intend to kill his victims, he does intend to involve them in a harmful explosion as a means of furthering his aims of winning the war. The strategic bomber, on the other hand, does not do this, does not intend this. His aim is to shorten the war by destroying the munitions factory, and that could be achieved just as well without causing any civilian collateral damage. He need not intend, in the narrow sense, to involve any civilians in the explosion that destroys the factory. We should also mention a further distinction that Quinn draws within the category of direct harmful agency, namely between what he calls direct opportunistic agency and direct eliminative agency. Direct opportunistic agency is agency which benefits from the presence of the victim. The victim plays an integral role in the agent's plan. Direct eliminative agency, by contrast, aims to remove an obstacle or difficulty that the victim presents to the agent's plan. They are an obstacle rather than a tool. In Terror Bomber and Guinea Pig, the agent's direct agency is opportunistic. By contrast, in the craniotomy case, it is eliminative. For reasons that will become clear in a little while, Quinn thinks that the doctrine of double effect should discriminate particularly strongly against direct opportunistic agency. All right. So far, we've been clarifying the precise content of the doctrine of double effect, according to Quinn. It is now time to talk about its rationale. What, apart from its agreeing with our particular intuitions, can be said in favor of the doctrine? Indeed, why should we accept the intuitions that support it in the first place? Here's how Quinn proposes to answer these questions. Someone who engages in direct harmful agency, he says, takes up a distinctive and objectionable attitude towards his victims. He sees them as, quote, material to be strategically shaped and framed by his agency, end quote. Consider the terror bomber. He has an aim, the demoralization of the enemy, and in order to further this aim, he must do certain things to the civilian population, for instance, dropping high explosives on them. That's integral to his plan. It wouldn't work without it. But of course, the civilians haven't voluntarily signed up to play this role, nor would they have any moral obligation to do so, Quinn thinks, even as civilians on the unjust side of the war. Rather, the civilians are merely being pressed into service by the terror bomber. Hence, in dropping bombs on the civilian population, the terror bomber, in a sense, regards the civilians as things merely to be acted upon, whether they want to or not, almost like inanimate objects. But this, Quinn thinks, is a very objectionable and disrespectful attitude to take towards other persons. As he puts it, the doctrine of double effect rests on the strong moral presumption that those who can be usefully involved in the promotion of a goal only at the cost of something protected by their independent moral rights, ought, prima facie, to serve the goal only voluntarily. By pressing the civilians into the service of his goals, the terror bomber overrides this strong moral presumption. That is what is so distinctly objectionable about this instance of direct, opportunistic agency. By contrast, Quinn thinks, it is less plausible to think of the victims of direct, eliminative agency as used in this objectionable sense. The fetus whose skull is crushed in the craniotomy case isn't made into a tool in the woman's project of survival. The death of the fetus is the side effect of doing what allows the woman to survive, not what directly enables her to survive. This may be the reason, Quinn conjectures, why the doctrine of double effect seems to discriminate against eliminative agency less forcefully than against opportunistic agency. And it may therefore help explain why some people feel that the direct agency of the craniotomy case is not much harder to justify than the indirect agency of the hysterectomy case, Quinn writes. So, the moral rationale that Quinn gives for our strongly divergent intuitions in the terror bomber versus tactical bomber case, or the guinea pig versus the direction of resources case, at the same time helps explain why there would be less of an intuitive difference between his craniotomy case and his hysterectomy case. This, to Quinn's mind, lends further credence to the doctrine of double effect. So that, in a nutshell, is Warren Quinn's attempt to provide a deeper justification for the doctrine of double effect in his paper. But has Quinn succeeded? Although the doctrine of double effect has numerous adherents, even amongst contemporary philosophers, there are also many philosophers who reject the doctrine. Two of the most prominent contemporary critics are Judith Jarvis Thomson, whose paper on the trolley problem will be the subject of our next lecture, and Tim Scanlon, the hero of our previous lecture. Thomson and Scanlon agree that there clearly seems to be a difference in the moral permissibility of the agent's actions in terror bomber and strategic bomber. But they doubt that the correct explanation for this difference in permissibility is ultimately about the agent's intentions in acting. What the terror bomber does is wrong, they claim, but not because of the intentions with which he acts. After all, they reason, if that were the correct explanation of why the terror bomber's actions are wrong, then a strategic bomber who also acted with the intention of killing innocent civilians, but in the course of pursuing a legitimate military objective, would likewise be acting impermissibly. But do we really believe that? To test this, let's consider the following case. Suppose you are the president of the country fighting the just war, and the commander of the Air Force comes to you and describes to you a planned air raid that would be expected to destroy a munitions plant and also kill a certain number of civilians, thereby probably undermining public support for the war in the enemy country. Now, if the commander asked you whether you thought this was morally permissible, would you say, well, that depends on what your intentions would be in carrying out the raid? Would you be intending to kill the civilians? Or would their deaths be merely an unintended but foreseen side effect of the destruction of the munitions plant? In other words, holding fixed the actual consequences of the raid, might an action be permissible if performed by an agent with one intention, but impermissible performed by an agent with a different strategy in mind? Thomson and Scanlon both concur in answering this first question in the negative. Here's a second case to make the same point. This one from Francis Cam. It's a version of the famous trolley problem, which we'll be discussing in our next lecture. So imagine, a runaway trolley is barreling down the tracks. Up ahead on the track are 5 workmen without means of escape. There's a bystander observing this scene. If he does nothing, the 5 will be crushed to death by the trolley. However, next to the bystander is a switch that can turn the trolley onto a sidetrack, away from the 5. Unfortunately, there's a single person on the sidetrack, likewise without means of escape. If the bystander turns the trolley onto the sidetrack, the one on the sidetrack will be crushed to death. Let's assume the bystander pulls the switch and turns the trolley. Given what I've told you so far, do you think that what the bystander did was morally permissible? Many of you, I bet, would answer yes. But suppose I now reveal to you the following further detail. It so happens that the one person on the sidetrack is that bystander's arch enemy. This is why Cam dubs this case the trolley enemy case. In fact, the whole reason why the bystander pulled the switch wasn't to save the 5 ahead on the tracks, but to turn the trolley onto his enemy on the sidetrack and kill him. In other words, his intention in acting was not to save the 5, but to kill the 1. Now, let me ask you, has this further information I just revealed to you changed your verdict about the case? Was what the bystander did morally impermissible because he acted with the intention of causing harm to another, even though doing so also had the foreseeable effect of saving 5 lives? Ask yourself this as well. If you could have stopped the bystander from pulling the switch, should you have done so because what he was about to do would have been morally wrong? Francis Cam, for one, thinks that the answer to all these questions is no. Although the bystander may have acted with bad or inappropriate intentions, that does not make his action morally impermissible. If you agree with this verdict, then you must think that something has gone wrong in the reasoning of a proponent of the doctrine of double effect. Here's the diagnosis given by Judith Thomson and Tim Scanlon. Proponents of the doctrine of double effect, they argue, confuse factors that are relevant to the evaluation of agents with factors that are relevant to the permissibility of their actions. So they confuse agent assessment with act assessment. An agent who acts from bad motives, for example, with the intention of causing death or harm to another, may reveal a bad character and perhaps deserves blame for his action. But as Cam's trolley enemy case illustrates, the agent's intentions in acting don't necessarily make his action morally impermissible, don't make the action morally impermissible. As Thomson writes, the appeal of the doctrine of double effect depends on a failure to take seriously enough the fact, I think it is plainly a fact, that the question whether it is morally permissible for a person to do a thing is just not the same question as whether the person who does it is thereby shown to be a bad person. There is such a thing as doing the right thing for the wrong reason. But if the doctrine of double effect should be rejected, as Scanlon and Thomson believe, what then can explain the intuitive verdict that while tactical bombing is sometimes permissible, terror bombing is wrong? In his book, Moral Dimensions, Tim Scanlon offers the following alternative explanation. In war, he writes, one is sometimes permitted to use destructive and potentially deadly force of a kind that would normally be prohibited. But such force is permitted only when its use can be expected to bring some military advantage, such as destroying enemy combatants or war-making materials, and it is permitted only if expected harm to non-combatants is as small as possible, compatible with gaining the relevant military advantage, and only if this harm is proportional to the importance of this advantage. In the example of tactical bombing, it is assumed that the destruction of the munitions plant constitutes a military advantage in the relevant sense. Bombing it is therefore permissible if, and only if, the conditions I've listed are fulfilled, only if harm to non-combatants is minimized and the expected harm is proportional. If there is no munitions planned, but a bombing raid that would kill the same number of non-combatants would hasten the end of the war by undermining morale, this raid, a pure case of terror bombing, would be not permissible under the rationale just given. It is impermissible because it can be expected to kill people, and the circumstances do not provide a justification for doing this under the principle just stated. The death of non-combatants is not rendered a military advantage by the fact that it would shorten the war by undermining public morale. So the fact that it would do this does not bring the case under the exception just described to the prohibition against doing what can be reasonably foreseen to cause loss of life. A person who intends to kill non-combatants in order to shorten the war by undermining morale and has no further justification for her action acts wrongly. She has an intention that she should abandon. But this truth should not be taken to suggest that intention has a fundamental role in determining the impermissibility of this action, in the way claimed by the doctrine of double effect. The intention is wrongful because the act intended is wrongful, and the act is wrongful because of its likely consequences, not fundamentally because of the intention. End of quote. So, who do you think has the better of this debate? Do you side with Thomas Aquinas and Warren Quinn and the defenders of the doctrine of double effect? Or do you agree with Thomson, Cam, and Scanlon in opposing the doctrine? I look forward to taking these questions up with you at our next town hall.